The Democratic National Convention sounds like it should be boring, but over the last 200 years, it's played host to some of the most dramatic scenes in American history. These are just a few of the most controversial moments ever seen at the DNC. The very first Democratic National Convention was held in 1832 in Baltimore. During the convention, the brand new party, rising from the ashes of the Democratic Republican Party, very quickly nominated Andrew Jackson for a second term. Jackson had been president since 1829, with John C. Calhoun serving as his vice president. But Calhoun had fallen out of favor, due in large part to his support of the doctrine of nullification, a controversial political theory in which states could basically ignore federal laws they disagreed with. Jackson and his supporters were vehemently opposed to nullification. At the convention, the delegates, instead of nominating Calhoun, chose Martin Van Buren as Jackson's running mate. Calhoun ended up resigning as Jackson's vice president, becoming the first person to do so. He was then elected a U.S. Senator for South Carolina, but his aspirations to one day be president were quashed. Van Buren, on the other hand, saw his political star ascend. He became the 8th U.S. president. In the spring of 1860, the Democrats held their convention in Charleston, South Carolina, but things didn't go well from the start. The delegates, mostly over the issue of slavery, were unable to nominate a candidate. Eventually, a number of Southern delegates walked out, and the convention ended without anyone being nominated. They tried again that summer, reconvening in Baltimore in June, but yet again the Southerners walked out. The remaining delegates nominated Stephen Douglas. Meanwhile, the Southern Democrats held their own convention in Baltimore and nominated Kentuckian John C. Breckinridge, who was then serving as vice president under President James Buchanan and believed slavery should be decided by the states and not the federal government. This resulted in 2 Democratic candidates, each claiming to be the rightful nominee, and one of the most chaotic presidential elections in history. In the end, Abraham Lincoln, the first candidate for the new Republican Party, won the election, which prompted the Southern states to secede from the Union, kicking off the Civil War. In a broiling hot summer in 1924, the Democratic National Convention convened at Manhattan's Madison Square Garden in what would end up being the longest convention in U.S. history. It quickly became combative. Already by the second day, the spectators were spitting on the delegates, who angrily wrangled over candidates and issues that included Prohibition and the Ku Klux Klan. It dragged on for 2 weeks amid a bitter fight between New York Governor Al Smith and William G. McAdoo from California. Reporter Elmer Davis wrote in the New York Times, "It is an inhuman spectacle. If the Democratic Convention were a fight, it would long ago have been stopped by the referee." Smith was anti-prohibition and anti-Klan. McAdoo, while not a member of the white supremacist terrorist organization himself, had the backing of the KKK, whose reign of terror soared during the 1920s. McAdoo also wanted prohibition to continue. Eventually, a dark horse candidate named John Davis rose to the fore as a compromise between the supporters of Smith and McAdoo. Davis lost resoundingly in the general election to Calvin Coolidge. In August 1968, the Chicago Police Department, under the autocratic mayor Richard Daley, and backed by the National Guard and members of the U.S. Army, clashed with anti-Vietnam War protesters outside of the International Amphitheater where the Democratic National Convention was being held. In what would later be called a police riot in an official Illinois state report, law enforcement violently attacked protesters and arrested hundreds of them. Judy Gumbo, a protester, recalled seeing police really roughing people up, doing terrible stuff to people. Inside the convention, delegates fought over platform positions related to the war, and in some instances, the fights turned physical. In the end, Hubert Humphrey won the Democratic nomination and lost to Richard M. Nixon in the general election, and the Chicago DNC became a watershed moment in U.S. politics. The Democratic National Convention is back in Chicago amid protests around another conflict. Several thousand people are in Chicago protesting Israel's ferocious military attack on Gaza that has left more than 40,000 Palestinian civilians dead. Many want an immediate, permanent ceasefire agreement and for the U.S. to stop supporting Israel with weapons of war. Besides protesters breaching the outer fence surrounding the United Center where the DNC is being held, inside the convention, protesters held up a banner reading "Stop Arming Israel." When President Joe Biden appeared at the convention in support of Vice President Kamala Harris, several pro-Palestinian delegates turned their backs on him in protest. Biden, a vocal supporter of Israel as president, admitted the protesters had a point during his speech at the convention.
Those protesters out in the street, they have a point. A lot of innocent people are being killed on both sides.
Leading up to the convention, the parallels to 1968 were hard not to notice. But will history repeat itself in Chicago in 2024? Only time will tell.